when I was a kid, I believed in all the rhetoric. I believed in all the things that coaches told me about how it was going to make me a great and all these things. And none of that stuff mattered. It didn't matter because it didn't teach me as a player. I was the most narcissistic, self-centered, self-absorbed, egomaniacal person you can meet. Fred, I win, you lose. That's it, right? I mean, and none of that didn't teach me to be a better father, a better husband, a better brother, a better son. It didn't teach me to be a better person. It taught me to be a better athlete, but not a better person. And there was nothing in the environment that softened those messages. And I was fortunate that I had really strict parents who made sure that those attitudes that I had on the football field did not bleed into the house.
Welcome to the Fred Opie Show, where we help students, parents, and coaches give their best effort on and off the field. Today on the Fred Opie Show, Syracuse All-American quarterback Don McPherson. A native of Long Island, we go deep into Don's career as a early day black quarterback back in the day when that was such a unusual thing to see. We talk about that experience. His experience of being recruited as a student athlete, his decision to go to Syracuse University, and why. Then we get into what Don is doing today. He spends a lot of time on college campuses speaking about violence against women and preventing that problem in that situation on many college campuses today. We also talk about the fact that he's raising two girls back on Long Island and his views, which have been evolving, about youth sports in America. This guy's got some interesting things to say, and I hope you will hang in there and enjoy the waxing eloquently Don McPherson. Why did you choose Syracuse?
Well, I grew up on Long Island, where I live now, and here in New York, and I wanted to stay close to home. The Carrier Dome had been recently built, and so the program was going in what we thought was the right direction, and I wanted to stay close to home. I had grandparents and cousins lived about 2 hours south of Syracuse, and it felt like home when I got there. I was recruited by a lot of schools around the country, as far west obviously as UCLA and USC and Miami and all corners. But I took one other visit other than Syracuse, and that was to Iowa, and that was more of a visit just to talking with my dad and my brother who also played in the NFL at the time was with the San Diego Chargers. Said, listen, why you owe it to yourself to at least go check out someplace other than Syracuse. And Iowa was my next choice, and so I made that visit, and it was clear to me when I got there that I made the right choice at Syracuse.
Do you have any at all roots, time spent thinking about it, stick in my hand every once in a while experiences?
Lacrosse? No, when they started the lacrosse program at my high school, I remember I was running track, and I remember watching those guys with sticks in their hands, and the only thing I could think of, it was the closest thing I ever came to considering a game like hockey. I couldn't understand playing a game with a stick in my hand. As a football player, that was like, man, I'm going to smack you with this stick on a regular. So that was the thing. I was like, man, they got sticks in their hands and they're just swiping at each other.
It's amazing because you were surrounded by so many great programs in Nassau County. And then you go on to Syracuse where, we had some great teams when me and you were both there. And, for those that don't know, I met Donnie basically sitting in a cold whirlpool as we both were rehabbing knees. So that's how far we go back. Donnie, tell people what you are doing now, what your line of work.
Work around sexual and domestic violence. I sit on two different NCAA committees, the Commission to Combat Sexual Assault and NCAA Task Force, and I'm on college campuses on a regular basis speaking and doing advocacy work.
Donnie, the sport of lacrosse has had a culture. It's been, I would describe as problematic.
As I said, I've been going in sports locker rooms and on college campuses for 23 years talking about sexual violence. And at the core of what I talk about is masculinity and how men behave. I don't talk about women. I talk about how we as men behave, recognizing that we're the perpetrators of the violence and it's our culture that needs to be addressed. And so, when I say our culture, there are all these subcultures. And what's really interesting about lacrosse, and Fred, back when we were in school, I may have been the man as a football player, but Syracuse University was not my campus. as a predominantly white campus and a wealthy campus, it was not my campus. I was an anomaly as I walked. You and I were an anomaly as we walked across campus at Syracuse. So no matter how big time you thought you were as a football player, socially, it wasn't your environment. So, but what was different at Syracuse, and I've been to a couple of schools, is really interesting. A couple of schools that are powerhouse lacrosse schools, where the lacrosse players are like football players. And at Syracuse, you guys were big time because you were winning national championships. You were at the top of your sport, and so you had that gravitas to that valid being valid. But the other thing you had, and maybe not the case for you as African American, but if you're a white guy on a predominantly white campus and the social structure is what you're used to, and there are more white women and white culture, it gets elevated. They're actually more vulnerable to some of these problems than the black football player who's from the hood, who's on a predominantly white campus, where socially he's more isolated. And so, yeah, lacrosse has and lacrosse has that because of the schools where lacrosse is big. There is for white men on those campuses, on predominantly white campuses, affluent white campuses where lacrosse is big, and I've been to many of these schools and I've seen this dynamic. It gets exasperated. And by the way, this is not a criticism, this is an analysis, because I feel like a lot of those white men, and this is a big problem with the conversation around masculinity, is that we're not talking about how toxic masculinity really impacts white men, and this is one of those ways.
What are the things that you bring when you go to talk to those type of campuses with lacrosse and elevated sport? What are some of the prescriptions that you say that our listeners could implement in their own programs?
I'll give you an example of something that happened at a program, and I was calling. It was just really more of a leadership conversation with a team, and the coach was a big time coach. And I called a couple of my lacrosse guys to find out a little bit about him, and it was just a well-respected coach, and so I went through this sort of a talk with their team, and at towards the end of it, and it was really about leadership and looking out for one another and taking care of each other off the field and those types of very positive leadership kind of message. But then I slipped in what I do around sexual violence, and I talked about the language that we use. And I always ask men, what's the worst insult you ever heard as a little boy? And it's you throw like a girl, you run like a girl, something that's saying, and in that I always say that we don't raise boys to be men, we raise boys not to be women. Because we use all this language of telling boys what not to be. Don't be soft, don't be a sissy. It's all misogynistic and sexist language. And that's at the core of men's violence against women. But part of that lesson is also breeding this really narrow understanding of masculinity. I have to be tough and strong. And this is where athletes get caught in sort of this double. It's a double whammy, really, because that's the message of what it means to be a man, right? Don't back down and all that nonsense. But in sports, that's what we have to be. We have to be tough and strong and can't fall down and start crying when bad things happen. And right, so as athletes, we get it on the field, but then we get it off the field as well because we're men. And so part of that language that we use in sports that we excuse and we think it's okay because we're doing it in the context of the game is sexist and misogynistic and homophobic. And I laid this out for these guys. I said, I want you to understand that when you're saying this to each other on the field and when you're saying this to each other, off the field, that you're creating this attitude and this culture and this climate, which is the big, the words that we use now about sexual violence on campuses. It's a culture and a climate. It's Baylor. What was the climate like? What was the attitude of the men about women? And so I explained that to them. And when I did that, and I do it in a very positive way. This is not you guys are bad. This is about how we all as men have been raised to sort of behave and talk to each other, especially in the context of sports. And when I finished, the coach came up to the front of the room, and I realized that he might have been a little bit mad because I was really getting down to some of the things. And he said, listen, I did this today. He said, I wouldn't be the kind of coach that I believe I am if I didn't come up in front of my team and tell you in front of them that I did this today. And this is something that I have to be mindful of, is the language that I use with my players and with my young men and what messages I'm giving them. Outside of playing sports, there's nothing wrong with being tough and strong and all that. But what kind of language are you using to instill those qualities? And I think that's, to me, one of the biggest things is that we have this sort of zero-sum game about sports. I win, you lose, and we use these expressions like pain is weakness leaving the body. It's all nonsense. It's hyperbole, and I have a chapter in my book that I'm working on that's titled "The Hyperbole of Sports is Used to Perpetuate the Myth of Masculinity," and it's a big problem. And I do believe it's at the core of a lot of men's problems in society, but also at the core of men's violence against women.
When you talk as an African American to these lacrosse players, our sport tends to be lily white. Let's just be honest, folks. Despite that it came from Native Americans, it's pretty lily white. Do you have to let them know about your bona fides first as an athlete before they take you serious?
Yes, I always say that my background as an athlete gives me the first 5 minutes free. They're sitting there for the first 5 minutes going, okay, what does this guy have to say if he's all those things? What's his perspective? I have to be really strategic with those free 5 minutes, because it allows me to set the stage for a conversation that very often men aren't ready to have.
I want to turn to youth sports. I know you're a father of 2 daughters. Is that right?
Yes.
2 daughters. So here's a question for you. What's something you thought was right about youth sports, but now later you learned was wrong?
All the altruism of sports and all the great things that sports is supposed to do, it didn't do. Why is that? If sports is this great character building experience, why do we have so many guys who were just not great characters? When I was a kid, I believed in all the rhetoric. I believed in all the things that coaches told me about how it was going to make me a great and all these things. And none of that stuff mattered. It didn't matter because it didn't teach me as a player. I was the most narcissistic, self-centered, self-absorbed, egomaniacal person you can meet. Fred, I win, you lose. That's it, right? I mean, and none of that didn't teach me to be a better father, a better husband, a better brother, a better son. It didn't teach me to be a better person. It taught me to be a better athlete, but not a better person. And there was nothing in the environment that softened those messages. And I was fortunate that I had really strict parents who made sure that those attitudes that I had on the football field did not bleed into the house. That I believe that sports has become a cancer in our culture because of the myth, because of all these automatic assumptions that we have about sports. When did sports become the be-all and end-all in raising our kids? It's a lie. It was never true.
Give us 3 takeaways.
Business changed the way sports functioned in our culture, and it exposed a lot of things about sports that were never true. How we are the only country in the industrialized world that attaches sports to higher education the way that we do, and the impact that has. Case in point, Baylor. Not just Baylor. When you have student athletes who fill 100,000-seat stadiums and can't read and do college work, when you have a basketball player at North Carolina who gets a standing applause for showing up in class because he hit a shot the next day, it's a very distorted environment in which we call these guys student athletes on college campuses. But the other thing on the youth level is what I said a moment ago. We say sports builds community. It doesn't build community. Not when you have travel leagues. Not when you're diminishing house leagues and you have travel leagues and you're starting to pick 1 or 2 kids from one community and then 1 or 2 kids from another community to go build a team that goes out of state. That's not building community. That's not building solidarity within your community. Or you have 1 child in a family where all the resources are going towards that 1 child because he or she is the hockey or soccer phenom that has to be in all the showcase tournaments. That's not building. That's not bringing families together. I spent a day in a hockey arena in Brooklyn a few weeks ago and watched how many kids were being neglected so that 1 kid could be on the ice, at a tournament for 7 hours. There's all these different ways in which we say that sports does things that it does not do and never did. And that's sort of there was a time, I think, when I grew up where the town came together around a sport, but that's also very narcissistic because it wasn't the town. It was just the families that were involved in that sport. And because the business got so great, sports got elevated to a place that it really, in my opinion, didn't really earn.
The show will be right back. For related content on negotiating the world of school and sports, visit our website at fredopie.com. Check out our podcast archive and review the show on SoundCloud, Stitcher, and iTunes. The best way to support the podcast is to tell a friend, share the show on Facebook and Twitter, or send them to our website at fredopie.com.
Hey listeners, if you're enjoying this show, be sure to check out the episode of the podcast where Fred interviews John O'Sullivan, the founder and director of the Changing the Game project, which is dedicated to improving the experience of children and youth sports. That podcast is available on SoundCloud or wherever you listen to The Fred Opie Show, and here's a short clip from the show.
You create the best environment possible for as many kids as possible, right? And keep that environment as long as possible, and then let them grow, because athletic success before puberty is a huge non-predictor of success later on. Usually the kids who are successful when they're young are the kids who are relatively older. They're born within 4 months of that calendar cutoff date. The kids develop on different timelines, and when you think about an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old who was born in January versus December, that year, that's 10% of their life.
Once again, that was John O'Sullivan on The Fred Opie Show. You can check out that episode on SoundCloud, iTunes, or Stitcher, wherever you listen to the podcast. Now let's get back to the show with Fred and former Syracuse starting quarterback Don McPherson.
When and why did the light go on and you became a revisionist scholar of sports?
It started when I was 8 years old, and I didn't want to play football. I was scared to play, and I ran off the field twice crying. It's a story I told to kids for years, and I had to play because I had two older brothers. One ultimately became the second-ranked middleweight in the world as a boxer. The other one, at the same time, was playing professionally for the San Diego Chargers, and I had to play. It was almost like a mandate from my family. If I wasn't a real McPherson boy, unless I did that, and unless I played. And then by the time I got to high school, I transferred to another school simply because of football. And I so I had a longer walk than usual. I walked uphill both ways, right? And I had to fight off the bear with my binder. I mean, I walked to school with these constant conversations in my head about why did I make this decision to go to another school just because of football. And on top of that, I was a quarterback, and I went to this other school that was a predominantly white school as a black kid in the 70s, late 70s, and I knew that to many people, I was still a nigger on the street. But to the fans, I was okay. And so I grew up, I was born in 1965 during the Civil Rights Movement. And I understood, the deep-seated racism that existed in our country. But at the same time, as a football player, I was given a pass. So from the very early in my life, I saw this mandate about sports and sort of how it was attached to my identity. But then at the same time that I understood the hypocrisy of sports, because it was okay with me as a black man as long as I was playing the game, but not okay with me as a black man if I was just walking down the street. Those things were visible to me as a kid. Especially here on Long Island. Long Island's one of the most segregated areas in the country. We, by neighborhood, we are segregated by every demographic. So I was very familiar with sort of how racism and sexism and anti-Semitism and all that really functions in our society. And I watched it and I experienced it as a kid in a very visceral way.
There's certainly the yin and the yang.
Yep.
There's the accolades. There's the passport that you get as an athlete, totally clear with that. Yep. But then there's the consciousness speaking to you about, man, this is a crock.
I loved practice as much as I loved games because I was just with my boys and we were playing and we were competing. I love to compete and I love the game. I love some of the nastiness of football. So, I'm sitting here holier than thou. I love big hits and I love guys getting decleated, all the things that we want against now because of concussions and all that. I love that. And I love the game. I love the strategy of the game. It was all the things around the game that were, increasingly distasteful to me. And I was fortunate that while I was in college, yes, you're right, I had to suppress all of that, all of my social justice leanings. Before the draft in 1988, I sent a letter to all 28 general managers in the NFL telling them not to draft me if they weren't going to play me at quarterback. So, yeah, there was always a social justice sort of bent to how I looked at my role as a quarterback. And I hated the accolades. That's one of the reasons why I walked around campus in a shirt and tie in college. I didn't want people to it was bad enough, I had an afro and I was one of the few black guys on campus and the quarterback of the football team. I could not be inconspicuous. And so that's one of the reasons why I wore a shirt and tie, because I wanted to control at least part of the narrative of my identity that I was very cognizant of. And that the shirt and tie thing started when I was in high school. Because I was very aware of it. So it was always, like you said, yin and yang, always a tug of war with my identity as a person versus my identity as an athlete that I was hyper cognizant of.
What's something you believe about youth sports today as a dad, as a husband, that everybody else thinks you're crazy?
We're no longer spending time with family because we're spending the entire day in a car. We're traveling on weekends, and all of a sudden, all these things that we're doing that are taking away from the quality of life as a family because of the demands of specialization and travel and all that. That to me is antithetical to what family should be about. And this is, I think, is a really critical point. Kids love to play. And as adults, we have co-opted the thing that kids love for the sake of a business. And I once had a mother many, many years ago up in Manhasset on Long Island. And she said to me, "What happens if my son's not good enough to play? Where does he go?" And I said, "Well, how old is your son?" And she said, "He's 8." I started crying in front of this audience. That's a crime. There's no reason. Listen, up until the time you're being paid professionally, you're playing. You're playing. It is a game. And at this point that adults have said that a kid is not good enough to play, that is one of the greatest crimes in as an athlete, as a person who loves play. It's one of the greatest crimes against humanity, is that we have co-opted what children love to do. And I had a parent once who said, "Well, my daughter plays tennis a couple days a week. I think she should go to a third day, a fourth day, or whatever it was." I said, she goes, "How do I know if I should put her in another day of lessons?" I said, "This is what you do. So you take a tennis ball and you take a racket and you put it in the middle of the living room and you walk away from it. And if you come back an hour later and it's still there, your kid doesn't want to play tennis."
Ooh.
But if your kid is against the wall, bang, bang, bang against the garage door, and you have to go yell at your kid to put the racket down, then your kid wants to play. That's it. If the kid is not going out there and self-motivated, Fred, remember the little football game we used to have in our hand, little touchdown game. If that was an Olympic sport, I would have been a gold medal winner because I was on that thing nonstop. Because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to play. One's 11, the other one's 13. And I told them, I said, the minute that I have to spend more time on your sport than you do, you're done. And that includes me driving. So the minute that I have to spend more time on it than you spend on it, you're done, because you're not then self-motivated. And if you're not self-motivated, it becomes the agenda of the parent and not the kid.
You're right. You can't be ahead of the kid with the sport. It's crazy.
People have always talked about parents living vicariously through their kids. I don't think it's that. I do think that there's a real misguided fear among parents that if they don't do these things, that their kids are going to be left out of something. And that comes from this bigness of the business of sports that is really also alive. It's the myth of the college scholarship. There's all these misinformed parents who did not grow up in sports. They grew up. Many parents grew up being discarded from sports because that's what sports does to you. It discards you. It kicks you out at early ages in life. And so you have a lot of parents who just don't simply give it more credit than it deserves as a quality that their kids need in their lives.
So what is the other extreme, though, of the parent that doesn't want their kid involved at all in sports? Tell us where you are with that. What does your child need to do in terms of activity, action, and words to convince you, yeah, she's serious, and now I'm going to support her?
I'm not completely, totally against it. I pick and choose my battles. As I said, my youngest played. She played for a number of years what she called soccer. She played, every Saturday morning, got together for a half hour and ran around the field. Was there. I clapped for her if she did something good, and I clapped for her if she did something bad. And so it wasn't that they weren't allowed to do it. I'm not completely agnostic to the idea. I think that a kid has to show that they are so hungry for it that they're going to pursue it. And by the way, that's true of everything. That's true of whether or not they're in music or in art or any other extracurricular. They have to do something that they're hungry for, that speaks to their passion, that speaks to their soul. They don't have to identify it as kids, but they have to. If anything, you want them to identify exploration as kids in every way, intellectually and physically. You want them to be able to grow their minds so that they're reaching their full, and I don't want to say full potential, but the full potential that they want for themselves.
Mm. So for you, if you were to write the memoir and the chapter on parenting, where does this come from? Does it come from what your mom and dad modeled from you? Did it come from positive and negative observations that you saw from when you were 8 years old to when you stopped playing? What has shaped your views about youth sports?
I think, yes. My parents had a very interesting style together. My father, very stoic, very reserved, did not grow up with sports like football. He grew up in Jamaica, in the West Indies, with baseball, was not familiar with the culture of football, so he kind of stood back on football and just watched and observed. My mother was very nurturing, very caring, and she was a school nurse, and so I had that sort of the best of both, of sort of those really hyper-loving and hyper-stoic parents. And I think the one thing that I got from them early on was that it was my choice, and it was my choice to either play or not play. And my father took me up there 2 years in a row, and I left the field crying, and then for the third year, he didn't bother. He didn't even talk to me about it, and I went up on my own, and I did it on my own. And that's why I said he didn't even know I was good until he read it in the paper, because it wasn't him saying, you have to do this, even though my brothers were tearing it up. And so I think that is I don't think parents need to be indifferent to their kids' activities, but I think they need to be spectators to their kids, and true spectators. And I don't mean fans. I mean spectators. I think we have to watch. We have to be there. We have to pay attention. We can't judge. I mean, I can't judge even if my kids are doing things that I don't. My one daughter's in a play. She'll be in a play tonight, and she loves to act, and she loves it, and she blows me away, because I don't know who that kid is when I watch her, and I'm fascinated to get to know her, because I'm a spectator of her life. I don't run her life. I'm a spectator, and I have to be supportive, and I have to do all the things a parent does. But when she chooses her activity, I have to be supportive and silent, and let her tell me what the day is like, not let me tell her what she did wrong or right. And that was always the thing that I remember about my father is, I used to, the walk home from school would take me an hour to get home from school, and I would spend that hour thinking about everything that happened in practice so I could tell my father. And I would get home and I would have it all memorized in my head, because I relived every play in practice. I relived and I came home to tell him what happened, or tell my mom what happened. Nowadays, you have parents who, before the kid even gets off the field, their parents telling what they did wrong. Mm. And so, for me, I fell in love with the game because it was mine. It wasn't something I was doing for somebody else. That's why I soured in professional sports. As soon as the game became a business and I was doing it for somebody else, it wasn't much fun anymore.
Do you think lacrosse is immune from some of the other problems with the revenue sports because it's a non-revenue sport? That's one question. But at the same time, lacrosse increasingly is becoming a non-revenue sport at the youth level, whether it be the club teams, these tournaments that are everywhere, the clinics that people are running. As one of my friends, Fred Cambria, who's a filmmaker, played with us at Syracuse.
Oh, yeah.
He said, we have a problem in our game of profits making profits.
Yep. And the thing about lacrosse where I think, as I said to you a minute ago, Fred, I think every, you can if you choose to be the critic, as I am want to be, and I don't criticize things I don't care about. So I'm a critic only because I love what I'm a critic of. So if you look at where lacrosse is vulnerable in regard as a revenue sport, you have to look at the schools where lacrosse is big. And we'll take Syracuse as an example, but if you look at where lacrosse is big, and it's moved past the Mississippi now for a number of years, but prior to it moving past the Mississippi, and really what does lacrosse look like on the West Coast, separate aside from the East Coast, look at the schools where lacrosse is big. It's the Ivy Leagues. It is Hopkins and Virginia and Maryland, and you look at those schools. Those are really expensive schools to go to, and a scholarship to those schools. You're talking about revenue sports. That's a revenue sport. When you talk about going to Syracuse as a non-revenue student athlete at Syracuse University, and your scholarship is worth $67,000 a year, that's a revenue sport to the parents. It may not be a revenue sport to the school; it's a revenue sport to the parents, and it comes with its own set of challenges because you're not that big time sport, because you're not going to get that added support and help from academic services or other places, because you're not a revenue sport, but you still required to meet requirements, and that starts in high school. I mean, that starts at youth sports, because there's tremendous pressure. If you're here on Long Island, there's tremendous pressure when the recruiters come through, and there's some state schools. But there's also the Ivies, and there's also Hopkins and Syracuse, and those large private institutions where tuition is out of control, and you can go play lacrosse and get a scholarship because it is such a popular sport. There's equal amount of pressure in that environment, and it's financial pressure as well.
Donnie, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of what I know is an extremely busy schedule. I want to also take the time to just praise you for the kind of work you're doing, the kind of stance you're taking, which is not at all popular. One thing I have known about you since we were in school together is you are a nonconformist, and you are consistent. That's for sure.
I'm consistently inconsistent.
People want to know more about your work, about your publications, and other ways of listening to you talk. How can they find out more?
I have a website. It's donaldmcpherson.com. But you can also obviously follow me on Twitter at Don McPherson, which is probably the best way.
All right, man. Be good. And I look forward to meeting the girls one day.
Yeah, likewise.
Now, Don is a guy who is, as he says, he likes to be controversial, but for a positive reason. His view of youth sports is very interesting, to say the least. The fact that everybody else is talking about how sports can build character, he argues the opposite. He talks about some of the problematic parts about youth sports that as parents and coaches, we need to be aware of and to prevent from happening. As he said, for him, his playing experience from youth sports all the way through professional was the dialectic of the yin and the yang. And that is true and for many of us about things in life that we deal with. But again, I hope you enjoyed our interview with Don McPherson. I'd say if you enjoyed this one, you should go back and pull up the one with Syracuse linebacker and now Director of Football Operations at Boston College, Reggie Terry. A lot of similar type of comments about the inside view of sports. I hope that you enjoyed this as much as I did, and that you'll share it with people via a link or an MP3 download from our site. And there are lots more of great interviews with former All-American players as well as coaches in the Hall of Fame. Thanks again for listening to the show. I love giving talks on the topic of school and sports. For more information, email the show at fdopie@gmail.com. Once again, that's fdopie@gmail.com. You can also contact us if you're interested in advertising on the show. The best way to support the podcast is to tell a friend, share the show on Facebook and Twitter, or send them to our website at fredopie.com. Thanks for listening, and be good.